I'm delighted to welcome in the Autocar studios a very special guest, Mr. Sachin Lawande, who is the President and CEO of Visteon Coporation. Sachin, real pleasure to have you here. I think with you it's going to be a very fascinating discussion on tech, where the market is going, AI. You've obviously got your roots here. You know this market very well. I want you to kind of, just give a, let's say, a broad kind of view on the tech race. Recently, we've seen a car like the Tata Sierra in this segment offering 3 screens for the first time. HUDs are coming. I mean, the tech race, is it going to stop? What's driving it? And, just your thoughts on, where's it going to end?
Absolutely. First of all, Hormazd, thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure always to talk to you. I always have a great time. I travel a lot, and I think that does give me a pretty good perspective on the industry, which is what I like. The second thing is, this industry, although it's very large, it contributes, as you know, a significant portion of the global industrial GDP.
Right.
Right? And yet, it's actually a small industry.
Yeah.
If you work in it for any number of years, you do get to know.
Well, it is small, and I'll be honest, I think when we had the chip crisis, it was clearly at the bottom of the ladder for the chip makers, because they had other clients and,
much bigger.
Yeah, exactly. The mobile industry, everyone else, tech industry wanted the chips, and I think it kind of told us where the auto industry is in let's say, in the
hierarchy. Absolutely. And though, having said that, we must also recognize that it's moving up in the significance strategically, because the usage of technology and chips and so on is increasing in auto, and it will continue to increase. And as you asked the question, where is this race going? Is it showing any signs?
That's right. I just want to start with that. It's
Correct.
a very, rather than getting very broad-based, just
Correct.
with that, because we've just seen something like a Sierra being launched. Now Mahindra has also launched cars with 3 screens. This is getting democratized more and more.
Correct.
What is driving that? Where is it going to end? Is that the differentiator? Because it's no longer the power of the engine,
correct,
but the power of the chip, which is making the difference.
Absolutely. And technology is the name of the game. But let me just maybe walk back a little bit in terms of how this has evolved. Where are we at as we speak? And what is likely going to be the case in the future? And the timing of this conversation is actually very apt. Because
I like to look at it as we are actually a quarter century into the next century.
That's a great perspective to have, right?
Isn't it? And 2025, I mean, so.
Indeed, and especially because automotive, if you think about it, started in the previous century.
That's
so now we are in the quarter part of the second century of automotive. And so clearly it's come up a long way from what it used to be, right? We all grew up in an era where cars, we really thought about as powerful engines, and we wanted the biggest engine and the fastest car and the handling and the driving.
That's right.
That was what we grew up with. Now, the generation that is growing up buying cars, that are maybe buying the first car, are not looking at the size of the engine, the horsepower, or how many cc's.
They don't have an engine, just a motor.
Absolutely, right? And so all the focus is now more on the tech. And the tech has actually evolved from the days where it used to be merely a side function to now, with so many screens and safety features also coming in, it's become the central piece of the value proposition.
And tell me, what are the tech enablers? Clearly, it's down to the chips. I mean, I think the race, or let's say the drive to pack more into every chip, advanced nodes. Is that really the core of it? Because without that, we would not be able to get such powerful, what I would call computers on wheels.
So the car has an interesting limitation that is not talked about as much as it should, which is, it is the most sophisticated tech that most consumers will ever own in their life. There's nothing in your home that has more tech than what cars have today. Nothing in your home that has as many semiconductors as your cars have today, and software.
And have to work in adverse conditions.
Exactly.
From 0 degrees to 50 or minus 20 to 40
and
or whatever.
on roads with various varying conditions and vibration and dust and everything else in between, right? So it's a very challenging, demanding environment that is growing rapidly in terms of the amount of technology it's attracting. And now we're at a point where in the past where the automotive used to kind of lag mainstream tech, that's no longer the case. You know, all of our consumers' expectations have been set by smartphones and cloud technologies, and they fully expect the car to also enable similar experiences, right? And the enabling capability, to, as you rightly pointed out, at the lowest level is how much performance in terms of the CPU and the microchips you can pack within a very limited power sort of allocation, right? So in the car, you do not have endless amount of power. You are still run off of a battery. Now with EVs, that is changing. So the fact that we are going towards hybrids and EVs, now even ICE vehicles will soon have 48-volt batteries.
Right.
We're going away from the days of 12-volt battery that we have known for the longest time, right? Lead-acid battery. The problem with 12-volt batteries was that they could only power so much tech.
Right.
Right. So now EVs, full EVs, obviously have virtually limitless power.
Right.
But even now, mild hybrids and strong hybrids
Got a 48-volt system.
with 48 volts give you a tremendous amount of power. That juice is important.
Right.
Now, along with the juice, obviously you want to be very frugal in how you want to use it. You want to be very economical. You don't want to generate a lot of heat. So this is where the advanced nodes come for to a huge advantage.
Right.
The lower the node, the more advanced it is, the more performance you get within the same power and thermal envelope.
Right.
Right? And the defining sort of edge is about 30 watts of dissipation. The moment you go in a ECU more than 30 watts, you have to introduce liquid cooling.
That complicates things.
That complicates things. It makes things more expensive.
Yeah.
Now, the
Packaging
good news
is an issue.
Exactly. The good news is the industry has gone down to less than now 5 nanometer chips. You get a tremendous amount of horsepower. If you look at the latest cars, the cars that you mentioned, like especially from Mahindra,
right,
they're leading the industry in terms of the kind of compute that they're putting into these cars. That is enabling a tremendous amount of
And it's
features.
almost like the chips are becoming the heroes, like Snapdragons,
Exactly,
it's like the way Intel was many years back, So I think it's literally they are becoming the heroes more than any other part of the car, because that, as you rightly said, is what is determining that I can have so many screens, so many ADAS functions, all the gadgets and gizmos.
So the other thing that you notice is that cars are increasingly connected.
Yeah.
Many of these cars that we're talking about have embedded within them a modem, right? Or what is known as a TCU, a telematics control unit. And with 4G and now emerging on the horizon 5G, you will be able to do things like software update, access information in the cloud, which also needs, by the way, more processing power inside the car.
Right.
Now, having said that, we are at the cusp of a very interesting change, which is just showing up on the horizon, which is artificial intelligence. This is going to drive a super cycle of growth. You asked the question earlier, is this going to end, slow down, or what will happen to the tech race?
So on AI, I wanted your thoughts on that. How is that going to impact the cars and the way we drive and kind of change the whole experience of mobility?
Great question. And AI actually fundamentally changes our capabilities in two areas. One is self-driving, autonomous driving, right? And Tesla, for example, who's the leader in this today, has shown what full end-to-end AI with the launch of FSD 12.5 and later, what it can do. Today, and I'm one of those users, when you drive Tesla in full self-driving mode, you can drive a couple of hours without ever touching the wheel, even under the most adverse conditions. A colleague of mine recently took a drive from Michigan to Tennessee, a distance of over 1,000 miles, and that entire distance, including taking restaurant stops, and then going to his destination, he had to touch the steering wheel only 3 times. That's just remarkable. What that does do, that not only makes the driving more convenient, but it also increases your safety.
Right.
Because the car is able to watch its environment because of this technology much better than an average human can.
Correct. And
right?
let's say the error always comes from the human.
Human, right? So on one side, it will hugely improve safety. On the other side, now this is the part that is actually very new and very interesting, is all these new models, this so-called Gen AI models, right? Chat GPT, DeepSeek are something, things that people know and hear of, but there are many more. That technology is coming into the car, into the cockpit. Now, with more and more tech and tech-driven features in the cockpit, one of the things that the industry has been thinking about is how do we come up with a smart assistant that makes the whole experience more intuitive. It's no longer good enough to put all these features, but then have the user essentially fumble to figure out how do they use these features. We can now pack a lot of features inside the car, right? But the fundamental task of driving is still to make sure that you drive safely and get to your destination.
Right.
Now, how do you do that and yet access all these capabilities? So you needed a smart assistant technology. It turns out that Gen AI is an amazing technology that is now at our disposal for the very first time in human history that comes close to mimicking how humans think. And it is truly remarkable. I mean, today, I do not go through a single day without using these technologies. I typically use Grok
Right.
as well as ChatGPT.
Right.
And I use it to perform my job as a CEO of the company on a daily basis. And it's
Right.
remarkable. Now, this technology is coming into the car.
But do you think with this technology coming into the car, where obviously voice commands will be that much better, it might make, let's say, this arms race of screens a little bit more redundant? Where do you see that going? We've already seen some Chinese companies, we've seen BMW, let's say just going the more minimalist way, because frankly, you just need a little bit of display and you don't need to fumble through controls. Almost every function, right now we've got, let's say, a few hundred voice commands, a few
Correct.
voice prompts. That may be to just anything later on with AI because it will understand what you want.
That is absolutely the case, right?
So do you think, it might make screens long-term redundant and, this kind of fad might disappear?
That's a great question. And I was in China earlier in November, spent a couple of weeks there, meeting with many car makers as well as partners, and walked away with a very interesting observation. So in China, the number of screens aren't growing, and the size, although it is growing, it's growing more gradually than in the last couple of years. And what is changing that? So they have realized that the real innovation is going to come from technologies like AI. So they're putting a lot of effort in building a platform, mostly in silicon and software, where eventually they can bring more and more innovation. Think of AI as pretty much like what we saw happen with the smartphone. When the smartphone first came, we had no clue as to the kind of things it would eventually enable you to do.
And what did it unlock?
And it unlocked a whole host of things that people had no idea
Absolutely.
would be possible when it first came on the horizon.
And made so many industries almost redundant.
Redundant.
like the small point and shoot cameras. I mean, they're gone.
Cameras,
because this
right?
is doing a better job.
Your ability to book virtually everything and
Exactly.
anything from airline
That's
tickets
right.
to restaurant reservations.
Yeah, I mean,
from
Uber
your
wouldn't
phone.
exist without a smartphone.
Amazing, right?
Yeah.
So the similar sort of transformation is going to happen with AI, right? So they have realized that, and they're laying the foundation for a multi-year path and journey to keep bringing more and more capabilities. But as part of that, the focus has shifted away from just putting large displays for large displays' sake.
Right.
Right? So now the displays are going to take a different form. They will be more functional and less the centerpiece of what the cockpit is, which is more or less what it is today.
But that's actually, if you look at it, that's what Tesla did
Correct.
15 years back. So it's literally going back to what Tesla was so ahead of its time then.
There's
one screen which does everything.
Correct.
And you don't need anything more. It's just, yeah. So
again, a good observation because, Tesla and Elon Musk have proven over and over again that they tend to be more right than wrong, right? They were also ridiculed for not putting a LiDAR, right? And yet, they're still the leaders when it comes to self-driving.
Right.
So clearly they saw something ahead of everybody else. Therefore, I tend to pay a lot of attention to what they're doing. And they're not going down the path where they're just putting displays for display's sake.
Or tech for tech's sake also.
Exactly.
Right. And, just a little bit on, let's say, talking about Tesla, you've talked about FSD. I mean, how has, Tesla managed it, without reliance on LiDAR, as you said? And do you think it'll reach a stage where the AI will be so clever that we could even have autonomous driving in India, FSD in India sooner rather than later. Because to be honest, the Tesla sold here, they've actually got FSD installed in them. It just needs a switch to turn it on.
Correct.
So they're ready. So just your thoughts on Tesla's approach to this and the role of AI in really learning the environment so fast.
Right.
The library of events it has to absorb.
Right. So and
then work in our environment.
What was interesting, Hormazd, is that when Tesla first started down this journey of self-driving, they used machine learning form of AI.
Correct.
Right?
Deep learning and machine
learning. Deep learning and machine learning. And deep learning and machine learning were fundamentally really good at detecting and classifying objects.
Got it.
Okay,
like building a library of
building a library. It gave you a situational awareness of everything around you.
Right.
And you could then develop a sort of a 3D point cloud of all the moving objects in relation to you. But then the calculation of what to do with route planning, meaning do you brake, do you accelerate, do you turn, was all written by hand. They were handwritten code, rules-based, that instructed the car what to do once it was aware of its situation. That was the situation until FSD 12.5. Then there was this massive realization because of the advances that AI made in the so-called this Gen AI, right? Gen AI are foundation models. What is different between the two? That machine learning and foundation models. And the fundamental difference is that by keeping track of the previous instances and then doing the same process as machine learning, it is actually able to predict what is the likely next thing that will happen, right? It was essentially done, if you think about it, to predict the next word in a language.
Right.
Now, the same fundamental capability proved to be of immense value in other things as well. So what they did was they were able to bring a lot of training video and train the model to now drive, instead of predict the next word, predict the next maneuver.
Right.
And by training and then correcting it, they were able to come up with a model. It's a massive model. What they do is they take 8 camera input, they fuse it into one image, then they feed it into this model, and that model spits out commands to the car based on what it has learned by observing millions and millions of hours of video.
Right.
So that model is much better driver than most of us. We may have thousands of hours of driving. We don't have millions of hours of driving, right? No one of us has.
Right. And that's just with cameras.
That's just with cameras.
No LiDAR.
And you don't need a LiDAR because, it's just like you capture all this experience. So what you have is you have a super driver, a driver that is never getting fatigued, has tremendous hours and hours of experience. Now bring it to the Indian context. It is a very similar process. So what they did, Tesla, with their massive model training capabilities, Dojo and all of the work that they did, they can now take video from Indian driving conditions and tweak the model to apply to the Indian context.
But our variables are too many. I mean, do you think it'll...
I don't think so. If you see, the problem, or not the problem, the experience shows that we can drive, even though variables are too many. You and I can drive on the road.
The view is that we could introduce it today, but you'd never get anywhere because it would stop at...
Today, perhaps.
Yeah,
because it is not
they see
trained.
someone standing on a divider, it might stop.
Correct, because it is not trained for this environment, right?
Right.
But if they capture you and me driving, capture a video, and now train the model that's already built, it will know how we drive in India.
Right.
And it will be able to maneuver.
So you think it could come sooner rather than
There
later?
is fundamentally no technical limitation to bring this to India and perform better than 99.999% of Indian drivers.
Wow. So you mean we are ready for it?
We are absolutely ready for it.
Just maybe regulation and all that is a different issue.
That's a different issue, and we'll have to get that at some point in the right shape. But I think we need to do it because that will make the tech industry here advance. Why is this important? See, to me, self-driving car is the foundation of future robots. The same technology
Optimus.
you need for robots, exactly.
Right.
Why was Tesla able to very quickly build an Optimus? They did not recreate the tech. It was fundamentally the same tech.
Right.
And we need that in India too.
And perhaps, for we have abysmal road safety, the worst road safety in the
In the world, perhaps, yeah.
This could be that final silver bullet, because at the end of the day, people talk about airbags and this, but I think it's down to the driver. I think we have the worst drivers in the world amongst them. No sense of any kind of discipline or regulation. And I think with, let's say, AI following some basic rules and kind of accommodating for the environment around, it could be a massive safety feature.
Huge, and we hope that this comes here very soon, because frankly, way too many lives are impacted in India today for reasons that could be avoidable. The reason I like this technology is because it is preventive. It's not after the fact trying to mitigate the impact of the event.
It's active safety.
Active safety, it prevents. I myself have experienced with Tesla. Yes, US is much different, but driving there can also be pretty catastrophic because of the speeds.
Right.
And my experience has been that it has helped me become a safer driver.
Right.
Even if you do not disengage your hands from the steering wheel, the amount of information it gives you as you drive makes you a better driver, makes you a safer driver. So there's no reason fundamentally, with the cost coming down to the levels that we predict, and we'll talk about that a little bit, there's no reason why cars should not have this safety feature.
Right. And Sachin, we talked about chips powering everything, but again, companies like y'all, Visteon, are very exposed to, let's say, disruptions in supply chain. Chip crisis, I think a massive, massive issue. I think, to be honest, a lot of, let's say, brands which had Visteon clusters, because of the kind of exposure to the chips, had real disruptions in production. How does one mitigate against this? Do you think this will happen again? Again, Nexperia issue also came up, and with these constant geopolitical shocks, it's not like we've not seen the last of it, and this is really now being seen as it's being weaponized by a lot of countries.
And it's going to be, as you've said, a issue that will only grow as we go forward. And the reasons are that...
Yeah, so what does even India do?
Yeah.
And what is really the way to kind of guard against this? Because at the end of the day, we know the chip is the most critical technology in the world.
Right.
We need it, and we can't do without it.
Exactly. And the first thing that India has to do is to develop its own chip sector. There's no way out of this by fully relying on imports for chips like we do today. Right? So, but that's going to take some time.
But do you think we missed the bus? Because, I mean, the kind of investment there is, you know how it is to get to even, let's say, we don't even forget about getting to the advanced nodes.
Yeah.
But even to the, let's say, slightly bigger nodes, 40 nanometer, thereabouts.
Yeah, I would say that for the last several decades, we did miss the boat. But I'm encouraged to see finally that at least some investment is going into the more, I would say, mature nodes.
Right.
Okay. Now, if you look at automotive, the chip usage is not the same. Okay,
we have a lot of mature nodes which you can
a lot
work
of mature
with,
nodes and a very few advanced nodes, and that condition will remain for a long time, right? If you think about what we do in the car, we do a lot of power management, we do a lot of analog I/O. There is a lot of interfacing, Ethernet, and so on. These are not advanced nodes by any means. These are more mature nodes. There's no reason why we cannot fab them in India. Now, the couple of fabs that are coming online very soon, hopefully, gives us an access to that part of the supply chain that did not exist here before. The second thing we will have to do, and this is not just related to India, globally, this whole chip crisis of the last couple of years and now Nexperia exposed a lot of the things that were kind of buried under the rugs. The supply chain was not very deep in the sense that the stockpiles were very minimal. Okay, typically the industry had less than 10 days of stock in the whole chain.
So just in time is now going to be a thing of the past, but what does that do to efficiency, especially cost efficiencies, because stocking, inventories, cash flow,
correct,
not really very good.
Not good and not trivial either, right? So the just in time came about for very good reasons that made the industry overall more efficient, and we could build cars more cost effectively. And the answer isn't simply to say, let's just go build a stockpile of chips, because that doesn't also work out because of changes, the cost involved, the operational challenges of keeping stockpiles when many of the components are shared. So ultimately, we need to get to a point where on account of this just-in-time that created, I would say, sort of an explosion in usage of chips, we will need to narrow it down to a known set of chips that are needed, reduce the variation that has been created because there was no penalty for having a huge number of chips in your portfolio, narrow it down, and do a much better job of understanding the whole supply chain and introduce multiple flows. What we have started to do, to answer your point, so earlier our designs used to be very specifically tied to a set of choices we made for the chips.
Now you're taking more generic chips?
We take also an approach where we design for multiple sourcing. So no one chip that is selected that can present a single point of failure in the design. Now, that doesn't really work across the entire set of chips. If you're going to use a Snapdragon, you are not going to find an alternative for a Snapdragon.
Right.
But the 90 other chips that you use, you will find alternatives for, right? So it reduces your risk quite a bit. So by taking some measures, we can mitigate the issue. It will not completely go away. India is even more exposed because of what I said, because our reliance on imports is a little too high. Partly what we're working on, and this is not only for chips, the same thing exists for displays, is to drive more vertical integration, bring portions of the supply chain to India. We at Visteon are working with a Chinese company to establish a joint venture for bringing the back-end process of displays manufacturing to India. Displays are manufactured much like chips. You have a front end, which is the fab, and then you have the back end that takes the output of this fab and creates a display out of it. Today, the whole chain resides outside of India. We want to be the first to bring at least the back-end piece here. And then we will, as the industry grows and the demand for displays grows, India is going to be a 5 million car market here very soon. We think that more than likely that by the end of this decade, it will be closer to 7. And with the demand for displays, there should be a reason to even bring the front end of displays. And automotive is not the only user, right?
Yeah.
There are other devices that need displays. So we are counting on the fact that there will be front ends established in India, much like how fabs for semiconductors are.
Right.
And we want to have the automotive portion of it also established so that we can then build the whole supply chain locally. It's going to take some time. It
Right.
won't happen overnight. But if the policies that are now being thought about were to be in place, let's say a decade or two ago, we wouldn't be in the position we're in today, right? So,
Right,
but
yeah.
at least finally we're doing something about it.
Right, exactly. Better,
Late
better
than
late
never.
than never.
Exactly,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly,
Sachin, I want to get your perspective on China
Yes.
and the rise of China.
Yes.
It's been, let's say, an incredible story. Today, they are really a dominant force in the automotive industry. We've seen as far as tech goes, they're making inroads into Europe. Of course, in India, geopolitical barriers are there, so they're not quite here yet. I wanted to give a perspective on the rise of the Chinese auto industry
Yes.
because, frankly, it's a story of just less than a decade in that sense, isn't it?
Absolutely. What's interesting is until 2020, just 5 years ago, the domestic market in China, 65% of that was served by global OEMs, 35% was by domestic OEMs. Just 5 years later, which in automotive industry terms is very, very short, right?
Yeah.
5 years is nothing, right?
Yeah.
In 5 years, they were able to absolutely reverse it. So today, this year, 70% of the market is served by the domestic Chinese OEMs and only 30% by global OEMs. And I predict that as we go forward, less than 15% of the market will be left for global OEMs.
So what made the Chinese domestic market pivot so rapidly? What were the reasons, and was the European industry caught napping, or the global
Absolutely,
industry?
and that's a great question, right? So until 2020, the Chinese car makers were kind of following the similar process and track as the global car makers. Their processes looked very similar, their ambitions looked very similar.
Life cycle management,
Life cycle
technical-
management, technology pace, the pace of introduction of vehicles, and the belief was
And still very ICE was still strong, where they
ICE
didn't
was-
have any, let's say, legacy advantage like the other OEMs had, the global OEMs.
Correct. But even if they were catching up, it was kind of trapped in the same model. Now, as the Chinese industry sort of really adopted the mobile tech ecosystem players into automotive. People like Xiaomi and others, Li Auto, Leap Motor, they all came from that space. They brought with them a very different mindset, a product development life cycle that was much more aggressive than what auto has ever considered possible. And they fundamentally challenged what was the accepted norm. We were used to thinking of car
3+3.
minimum 3, right?
3 facelift and then
That was the model,
yeah,
right? They fundamentally put it on its head and say, okay, the car must be built in less than 2 years. Now it is less than 18 months. Now they're approaching 12-month development cycle. Their question was, why cannot the car be built like a phone, especially EVs? What is the fundamental difference between EV and the phone? Not much. So they started to think about it completely differently. They started to approach more and more the Tesla model. Now, if you look at Tesla, their tech, the underlying silicon software development happens on a release train that is independent, divorced from the vehicle launches. They take that tech and then they take whatever is the latest and the greatest and build cars with it. But they continue to develop it. The auto industry built tech to launch a specific model. They launched the model, that tech development stopped until they started to work on the next model. So there wasn't that continuous development of technology and more exploration of what is possible, independent of vehicles being launched. And the vehicles, as they were planned, could just take advantage of whatever the latest advances were. So China figured that out, and they focused on EVs. It also was very lucky, you can say, that as these new entrants were experimenting to be China-like, the government policies also supported the growth of EVs.
Right.
If
Globally.
that was not to be the case, many would have died on the vine. They wouldn't simply have had the volume to survive. Now they have sort of crossed the critical mass. They've developed really strong capabilities, and there's no sign of them slowing down. So now their sights are on exports. The market, if you watch in China, domestic market is kind of stuck at about 25 million units, right? Pretty remarkable still. The third of the market is China almost, and now their sights are on exports. This will really shake up the industry like never before.
I think in Europe they are above 5% now.
They are about 5% and growing, right? And again, with still only a few car makers having ventured outside of China, we predict that the industry will be forced to deal with how the Chinese build cars fundamentally and sort of jettison finally this decades-old model, the 3+3 model, will have to be somehow jettisoned. Now the question is how many car makers are prepared to do so.
So it's very interesting. So what you're saying, Sachin, it's been a mindset.
Correct.
It's been a completely new structure, and the way we think of how cars are made, that has given Chinese automakers this phenomenal, let's say, position of strength and even leadership.
Correct. And when you talk about China, right, it's not just one-dimensional. It's not only technology leadership, it's also speed. We often talk about China's speed, right? So how do they accomplish this? It's worth just probing a little bit deeper into how does China make a car in less than 2 years when the rest of the world takes about twice as much, if at all. And even then, the tech isn't quite comparable. So the fundamental difference you see is that when they organize themselves to build a technology or a car, it is truly a collaborative work between them and the suppliers. Now, mind you, the suppliers also have to change because in the past, the model was arm's length. The car makers would write the specs, the suppliers would go back, work on the specs, come up with a plan and execute. That waterfall model was simply turned on its head. I will give a great example. We were selected by Geely to build a new cockpit system for them. It was the most cutting-edge system envisioned by them and the industry. And when they awarded the business to Visteon, the chip was not even ready. And so we had to work with a surrogate, something that approximated that chip to start with. But what was truly remarkable was we were in a group of 9 competitors competing for the business. We were one amongst 9. They down-selected finally to last 2, and then it was in the sort of 2-week period of time where they started to really evaluate one against the other in the final showdown to make a decision. We were informed on a Friday evening that we had won the business. Their request that evening was, come Monday, they would send 10 engineers to our headquarters in Detroit to begin work.
Wow. Wow, amazing.
I cannot even envision anybody else.
But what does the speed come from? Is it basically they work longer hours, there's just hungrier because there's not always a 9 to 5 culture?
Yes.
Is it government also pushing, or is it just frankly the cutthroat competition which leaves them no choice but to either be fast or perish?
Right, and long hours do contribute some, but that's not all of it. I do also acknowledge that many companies outside of China, there are people that are working longer hours, but are not accomplishing as much. And I think it is fundamentally a different way of thinking about how to build vehicles. It starts with when they have an idea, as they're evaluating suppliers, they do a lot of the groundwork at the time, working with suppliers. So much of the work that the rest of the industry does after they decide who to work with is actually being done while they are going through the
And the
selection
suppliers
process.
will invest in that even if they haven't won the contract?
That is kind of the prerequisite. So as I've said, the suppliers also have to change their model to be able to participate in the game. You cannot take this position that you will only start to work, put resources
After
after
RFQ.
you have won the business,
Yeah.
right? So you need to have a conviction within yourself as to what is your strategy, do you believe in it, and does that align with where these people are going? So they often ask the question, are you really prepared to work with us? Because we work differently, right? And at Visteon, we had to go through this complete metamorphosis in order to truly become a partner to them.
So basically you're saying even before the RFQ comes, you've done a lot of groundwork.
That's correct. So we have to work with the ecosystem leaders and people like Qualcomm and NVIDIA, right? As the chip is being defined, not even ready.
Wow.
Right? And so because they do the same
There's
thing.
parallel development going on.
Exactly. And this is apparently how some parts of the mobile industry works.
Right.
So we have often talked about how the mobile industry is launching phones so rapidly, right? Similar process. And they brought that mindset to automotive and operationalized it. It's one thing to conceptually know that,
Right.
but to change a big industry like automotive to follow their model, that was their genius. Now what they did was they didn't just change themselves, they changed the whole supply chain along with it. Not everybody did,
Right.
but enough did to give them what they needed to go forward. Now we have to do the same outside of China.
Right. And Sachin, I want to talk about the
Yes.
Indian industry as well. I mean, looking at where China is going, I mean, one can't help but feel a little despondent as to where we are. I mean, domestic market has been great. We're going to be crossing 5 million. But despite all this growth, we are nowhere globally. Why is it that Indian companies cannot be competitive, let's say, in key mature markets like the US, Europe? I mean, China, of course, we have our own
Right,
issues, but even
right.
Japan and other real markets where, or Korea, Southeast Asia, where Chinese are now coming in and dominating Southeast Asia, for example.
Right.
So,
If
we have 5 million. That's a lot. But we are nowhere, let's say, globally.
Yeah. If you observe these markets where you see credible and competent car makers have emerged and are thriving, you see one consistent theme, which is the number of competitors tend to be fairly high. You look at Europe, there are at least maybe 7, 8 really strong car makers in that market, right? You see China, of course, and then where you see a little bit of protectionist behavior, you see that the industry does not necessarily keep up with the latest and the greatest. And I would include US in that set. And therefore, if you look at who's really growing in the US, it's the Japanese and Korean OEMs who have taken more and more of that market. So India, I believe, is now gotten large enough as a market that it should deserve to have more players, more car makers, and competing for the various segments, which will make the industry more competitive. And I believe that's going to happen largely because a lot of the traditional car makers, global car makers, have also found it difficult to be present in China and enjoy decent market share. India will be in their sights. They will have to figure out how to compete here and what their strategies ought to be. But I expect more car makers to set their sights on India. And that is what I believe will make the whole industry from car makers to suppliers, and then to the ecosystem and the supply chain to be a lot more competitive. I'll give you some simple examples, right? Today, as big as India is as a market, we import practically 90+% of what we need to make the components that we make for car makers. Why should we have to import a PCB in today's times? And yet, today we have to because the supply chain isn't established. All of this adds to lack of speed, cost, right?
And geopolitical shocks.
Exactly.
Right. So that's interesting. So I think one is a lack of competition.
Correct.
I mean, it's
correct.
Let's say quite clear. We've got, as we did a podcast on it, 6 players dominate 94% of the market. Really, it's a closed club. But do you think something needs to be done with the structure of our market? It seems very hard to break into the mass market segment. Otherwise, either you have to invest a lot into what becomes a high volume, low margin game, or you're really at the top of the pyramid in a CKD operation, which is totally negligible.
Right.
So it is a challenge. I don't know what needs to change in the structurally for the market to really kind of make it a little bit more open and more of a level playing field.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't think I cannot claim to know what structurally should be different, but the result of the change should be more competition. I think competition is healthy. Competition will also create that broader ecosystem that we need. It's a very narrow ecosystem if you look at the Indian structure today compared to pretty much anywhere else in the world when it comes to automotive. China, of course, is a example where that is on the other end of the spectrum, right? But we need to be a lot more like China. I'll give a simple example. So in 2025 alone, there were in China close to 300 semiconductor companies, all smaller than, I would say, 500 people, that are serving the automotive market. Okay, these are the companies that have emerged over the last 5 years that didn't exist before that. 300.
Wow.
Okay, so when you talk about shocks like supply chain shocks, have you thought about why do the Chinese not seem to be impacted by it so much? They seem to be going their merry way. They haven't taken a hit. They still are growing, right? Their dominance is still growing. So they seem to have been able to skirt this whole supply chain issue completely and be protected from it, including the Nexperia issue.
Right.
Right? Nobody in China has complained about it as much as the rest of the world is.
Right.
So that tells you that they have a much more diverse ecosystem that they have developed domestically.
Right.
And when I was in China a couple of weeks ago, I was able to meet some of these companies. They're very small. Almost all of them are under $50 million in revenue, which is very small for a semiconductor player. And yet there are so many of them, they're thriving and they're creating a lot of innovative pressure inside that system. This is entirely missing in India.
Right.
Right? So how do we build this whole ecosystem up? It cannot be done just by policy alone. Investments have to come in. And this is where we want to play a part as well by bringing some vertical integration, bringing some technology that didn't exist here before. Now we are seeing more support from the government, which is absolutely wonderful to see. And I was in New Delhi earlier this week, meeting with some of the government officials. The intent is all there. And more investments have to follow as well. I do not see anything holding us back. Then kind of just this old practices that we have always taken, some bolder thinking has to be also come into play.
And do you think even a cultural shift in mindset, because to be honest, we've also been siloed in a very protectionist way of doing things in a particular way, and maybe just trying to make cost our only advantage, which sometimes comes at the cost of quality.
And I will give you an example of where we could be doing things different. So if you look at the China model, they question fundamentally everything, including how the chips were being built, the software was being built. We often talk about automotive as a very safety relevant product, and for good reasons, right? So the parts of the car which, if not done right, could have disastrous consequences. But in China, they have taken a systemic look at that and are able to, therefore, use a broader set of chips, take a different approach to safety. It's no less than ultimately what we get in our vehicles using our approach. So I'll give you an example. So in silicon, there is something known as different grades of the silicon. There's consumer grade, industrial grade, automotive grade. And these grades define kind of the performing range of that particular chip given various environmental conditions like temperature, right, dust environment,
Right.
The length of life that part is supposed to be able to deliver. Now, the industry has always used automotive grade, which, by the way, is one of the most expensive levels when it comes to fabricating a chip. When you build 1,000 chips, maybe less than 10% of those will turn out to be good for automotive. So fundamentally, it has a restriction on how much of the chips are available to you,
Right.
and therefore the cost, right? Now, China took a different approach. They are able to use industrial grade, which is one level below, or in some cases even consumer grade, and then create through design enough protection around it to detect failures and take appropriate actions.
Wow.
Now, this does require a certain level of getting comfortable with the risks associated with it, how much risk is acceptable, et cetera, right?
I can't imagine German companies doing this. Yeah.
Absolutely, because for I don't know how many decades they have lived with a certain known
And so many
established.
redundancies built in. Yeah.
Correct, and these are some of the things that we'll have to unlearn as an industry.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And Sachin, just last,
Yes.
just sticking to, let's say, the Indian auto industry.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think our products are not seen on European streets or or globally? And what is the one factor, do you think, or a few factors that really limits that? I mean, do you think it's down to design, quality, just we're not just competitive enough, and maybe our cars are too designed for Indian consumers now and not enough for the Europeans?
I think if you look at the export markets, whether it's Europe or US, they're very distinct markets with their own very unique requirements, right? If you look at US, which favors bigger cars, you can call them muscle cars, fundamentally very different than what the Indian consumer wants. I think from a large market perspective, probably the European market is probably closer to
Right.
the Indian market, and we should be
Yeah,
more
I'm
present.
saying Europe. That's why I said Europe. Europe
Correct.
is a natural,
Should be
let's
more
say,
present.
let's say a primary market for us to export.
Correct. But the European market is extremely sensitive to quality,
Right.
as we all know, because Europe has had a legacy, a long history of having cars being built, and the population is very savvy when it comes to safety features, reliability, and are extremely price sensitive. So that combination of good quality at a very attractive price, when I look at our current market offerings in India, if you look at a car that is very price competitive, it does lack the quality and the features, the comfort and fit and finish features that the market requires. And if you see some cars that have those, they are not necessarily very competitive. So the market, I think, needs to fundamentally, and the products need to fundamentally evolve in those areas, and that will only come if there's more competition here.
Right. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So even though we think we have, a very low cost, globally we are not very cost competitive, are we? Especially compared to China. And
That's correct.
and again, why is that? I mean, we think, well, manufacturing cost perhaps is low.
Right.
But sourcing, development, all that, I think we are, from what I understand, we need to be a lot more competitive, and that's where we lose out.
We will only be competitive when we build more of what we use in the country. We are still heavily reliant on exports or foreign tech.
You mean
or
imports?
Imports,
Yeah.
or imported tech, right? So we pay a premium on those things. We need the domestic ecosystem and supply chain to emerge. That's what enabled China to get competitive.
And that's what Maruti did when they came in.
That's exactly right.
Sachin, just to wrap up on a very pertinent note, what will it take for us to be globally competitive, even cost competitive? Because I think clearly, while we can localize. One is we don't have innovation here. We have to import the know-how again, which is costly. And so it seems that we have a long way to go to really kind of reach anywhere close to where China is. Yeah.
That's very true. If you look at China's story and even with China's speed, that was in the making for well over 20, 25 years, right? If you look at their 5-year plans that they had, and nothing in China is a secret, they published what their ambitions were in automotive, and they followed through with their policies, encouraging localization, first inviting global players to set up manufacturing capabilities. And if you notice, the first 15 years or so, they weren't really very competitive on the global stage. Nobody in 2015 or so would have said that within 10 years, they would be the most dominant competitive force in the industry. I would say even as late as 2020,
Right.
nobody would have said the Chinese would be the ones that we would be worried about as competitors only in 5 years.
Yeah.
Now, it all bubbled up because they kind of layered the foundation, starting with the manufacturing capabilities, but then now it has evolved into a very vibrant innovation culture. As I mentioned earlier, I was in China when I met with so many companies that were coming up with creative products and across the full spectrum, from the hard stuff like metals, castings. They're doing an amazing amount of work in casting, to semiconductors, to software, right? And it shows in the product. The products now, from a design, fit, finish,
Are world
quality,
class.
amazing.
Right.
There's no difference between their cars and a German car that has been built on decades and decades of experience.
So that's a
what
bit
has
of
to
a
happen.
sobering kind of situation for us.
It is.
For us to get there. So I think what you're saying is more competition, and our supply chain still very underdeveloped. We are we are importing a lot. We have the first step is localization, and beyond that is developing the local know-how.
As a company that's doing almost $350 million of business in India, which is not small, we rely on 90% of our raw materials to be imported in this country. That's
So
a
you're saying
huge
at tier 2,
percentage.
tier 3 level is a big, there's a big gap.
There's a big gap.
Right.
And we need to encourage the development of this tier 2, tier 3 supply chain and credible and innovative suppliers. And we are seeing signs of that, right? Even when you think about as simple a thing as glass, we use a lot of that in our displays. You have companies like Corning that has come now, Asahi Glass has come, right? But these are still relatively recent things. Now, yes, we can take comfort in that, but also recognize that the rest of the world isn't going to stay still, especially the Chinese.
Right.
So how do we catch up first and then accelerate? I still would like to see a lot more being done in that area, both from an industry viewpoint. I think the industry needs to encourage local supplier development, not simply take shortcuts and rely on imported components, but fundamentally, where will be the business reason to do so, right? That can only happen from competition.
And now we have scale as well. I mean, coming to 5 million units, it's a good number. I mean, to localize,
terrific,
there's no real
terrific.
excuse that way.
There's absolutely none. I think it's a terrific market and one that is expected to grow for a number of years. There's no reason why we should think of this as even a 5 million for the next few years, right? It's going to be more like 6, 7 million in the next 5 years or so. So all the reasons there. Now the industry has to also do its part.
Right. Great, Sachin. Fantastic talking to you, and thanks for giving us such amazing perspective and insights. I think, really your experience in China really has been absolutely fascinating, and I think clearly the Indian auto industry doing a lot, has grown rapidly, but of course a lot more to do. But I think we can take solace in the fact that this market is growing. 5 million is not a small number, third largest market. And I think really, obviously, potential is there. We just have to work hard at realizing it. Thanks really for being with us. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. I think I was completely fascinated by it. A real masterclass in that sense.
Thank you
and
very
really
much.
appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. And as much as we talk about what we want India to do more, we also have to recognize how far we have come along. So
Right.
I think there's a lot of good, but we should not be resting.
Absolutely, yeah.
On that note, thank
Never
you,
rest on
Hormazd.
your laurels,
Yes.
keep pushing. Thanks
Yes.
so much. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.